So back when Gen 1 and Gen 2 were created, there were two legendary Pokemon that we would later get that would serve as a mysterious type duo, as I like to refer to it as. And I've been obsessed with this for years, I'm not going to lie. So we have the story of Ho-Oh and Lugia. Now, if anybody's ever played Gen 2, we know that Lugia and Ho-Oh were actually two legendary Pokemon that would later go off to be their own trio. Like, for example, Ho-Oh was the trio of Suicune, Raikou, and Entei. We know the story of that. That was when the story burned. That's when the Brass Tower burned down. That's where Lugia actually ended up residing. And all that was in the remains was the Pokemon that were brought back to life, at some point sleeping at the bottom, and people still trying to investigate what had happened. But according to legend, it was the tower of where Lugia resided, but there was a mysterious storm that burned it down. It's possible Ho-Oh could have had something to do with it, maybe not, but all we know is that Ho-Oh departed as soon as it found out that Lugia was gone, and so it's possible it went to look for it. Well, if we go back even further, we know that Ho-Oh's story actually revolved around reviving people. And back in 1997, the Space World demo, it actually talked about, how the Unknowns were releasing the souls of people sealed away somehow. The Unknowns were, like, by definition, if you were to, like, they even did this in the third Pokemon movie, I do believe, even though the anime is different than the original plot. But if this is where they got the idea for it, it kind of made sense. Because back when the Space World 1997 demo came out, we know that Ho-Oh was meant to be in Generation 1 or Generation 2's storyline. And it's possible Lugia was going to be added later on regardless, but it wasn't mentioned because it was, it was supposed to be about a storyline. It was supposed to be saved for the anime. It was supposed to be saved for the second movie, Pokemon 2000. So we find out later on, though, that Lugia was... If you dig into Lugia's history a little bit, you find out that Lugia was actually originally supposed to be a female at one point, and this was actually based on, the creator that actually created Lugia. So this is what it leads me to believe. If Lugia's mystery is surrounded, and still a mystery rather, we still don't know everything about Lugia outside of its powers and all that it dwells at the bottom of the sea, be able to control stuff. Probably could give... it's possible then you have, like, Gen 3, like Kyogre being the creator of the seas and all that, of the Hoenn region. So is it possible that Lugia's on par with Kyogre? Or is Kyogre supposed to be a very powerful, it's more of the Lord of the Sea, rather, than Lugia ever would be. Of course, then you have, like, Rayquaza's airlock ability that it can nullify the weather-resistant patterns. So... who's really stronger, not type-wise, but powers, their powers in the ecosystem, rather. And going back to the Unknowns, is it possible that Ho-Oh and Lugia had something to do with the Unknowns, and could Arcturus actually control them? Would actually be interesting. But, so that's just to kind of give you a little history based on what we've found out over the years. Like, everything's kind of intertwining together somehow. But here's where it gets interesting, though. So, say we go back to Ecruteak City. Well, the city where Morty, or was it Marty, was the gym leader. I think it was Morty, was the gym leader, the ghost gym leader in the Johto region. Well, we find out that in that region that there were two towers. One burned down. Of course, that's where Lugia originally resided. It's possible the legendary birds, Zapdos, Moltres, Articuno, could have visited Lugia at certain points. It wouldn't be too hard to fly from Gen 1 to Gen 2, seeing how Kanto and Johto are really close to each other. And they are in Japan, so if that is true, then we also have the Brass Tower we also have the Tin Tower, where Lugia Ho-Oh was on the other side. That's where Raikou, Entei, and Suicune would eventually go. They'd move from one tower to the next, but they'd meet up every once in a while there. And they obviously are free roamers, so you couldn't find them in the same place for the most part. But they'd stick around their native land. So that much we know. So as time went on, we eventually found out that Lugia and Ho-Oh were what is known as a duo. Now, if Lugia was supposed to be a female at one point, And obviously, if you study Ho-Ho's history, Ho-Ho is a giant Chinese chicken, a rooster rather. So if that is the case, and if you're familiar, if you're a farmer, you know that roosters are male. Yeah, it's the male and the hens. Roosters incubate hens' eggs, and they have chicks. They also, not only that, but they also watch over the hens, and they usually get pretty violent as they get older. That sounds about right. But if we were to say that the story between Ho-Oh and Lugia are intertwined, is it possible that they could have had like some kind of a romantic relationship? And that's where this video is going to begin. That's why I gave you all that backstory, because this is actually kind of interesting to think about. Now, again, if you play Pokemon nowadays, legendaries are genderless, and this is true for the most part. But it's possible, under the pretense that I have described, that yes, Lugia was originally supposed to be a female, and it might still be a female. If we bring the anime up again, there was that one time where Lugia had a child. It's also possible. I mean, we don't really see Ho-Oh having children, and it's a different bird species. But it is well known that birds can intertwine. They can have offsprings with other species. They don't just necessarily mate with their own species. I think bird watchers report it annually every year. There's usually new birds that are popping up, new species that are popping up, and they're usually birds that we've never seen before. But I come to find out they're like a species that's similar to two of them at least. So, be like for example, it'd be like blue jays mating with red cardinals, for example. Both don't necessarily live in the same state, but they do migrate periodically here and there. So it is possible that, just to kind of give an example, some birds can be found together, although I have to look into that a little bit more. But anyways, so we know Lugia and Ho-Ho as a group of legendaries that are said to intertwine every once in a while. They watched over the same town, they saved basically the same people, but they all had different powers, though, coexisting together. Well, and right around the same time when Lugia departed, we find out that Lugia's departure really also rose emotions in Ho-Oh as well. Ho-Ho probably wanted to go find Lugia at one point because it found out that it couldn't exist without the other. Even if they weren't necessarily mating, they've just known each other for so long that they cared for one another. Lugia got scared when its tower burned down because it was essentially its home. Maybe it's possible Lugia could have done it. Maybe Ho-Ho did it. But maybe it makes more sense that Lugia might have accidentally burned its own tower down because it didn't realize how strong it really was. As for Ho-Oh, it didn't really seem... I mean, they took one bad omen, and they turned it around into something else. So what could have been Lugia's fault at first, and then Ho-Oh fixed it, and then now Ho-Ho had to go and left behind, like they say, like once the flames burned out, you had the lightning that struck the tower, you had the rainstorm that washed away, they had the flames that burned the tower to the ground, you had the rainstorm that rained out the, this is symbolizing lightning, fire, and water. That would be Suicune Entei and Raiko's powers. Their souls were eventually saved. There were a couple people that passed away, and they were reincarnated as the legendary Pokemon somehow. And what happened was Ho-Ho, after the tower had burned down and the flames had been put out, what was left of the second to the base ground floor of the tower, there was then a rainbow over it, symbolizing that the seven-colored rainbow bird had been there. So in this case, Ho-Oh. But that was just when Ho-Ho was then departing to go find Lugia, which if you played Gen 2, you know that Lugia wasn't really too far away from Ecruteak City. It basically just flew southwest to the other side where you had, what was it? That's where the Whirlwind Islands are. And I think it was the top right one was the correct one. You had to go in there. You had to have Flash to find your way through, but eventually, and you had the Rainbow. If you had the Silver Wing, you'd be able to find your way to Lugia, and Lugia would be in a little cavern, just hanging out by herself. It's actually very interesting. I think it's also worth noting that the reason why legendaries are genderless is probably because they don't breed as easily, so that way it kind of makes getting them harder. But that kind of really does seem interesting because the legendaries themselves could have been caught more than once originally. So it's also worth noting it's possible that while Ho-Ho and Lugia had been around for as long as they did, are they necessarily the same species? Could they have been the same ones from the beginning of time, or did they just have different generations of birds, and then over time they passed on? Like so like Moltres, Zapdos, and Articuno. Assuming you could catch more than one of them, that'd be another way to look at it too. I could understand that. So, but it wouldn't surprise me that at one point maybe Lugia was a female and Ho-Oh was a male because of the kind of bird it is. And right away, I wouldn't be surprised at all if there were reasons to believe that some of the stuff is still true, and maybe this was originally their intent at one point. They watched over each other because they were basically soulmates for each other somehow. So if that is the case, then there is definitely reasons to believe that they are not just connected, but they were also looking out for each other because they really did care for each other. Like kind of like a yin and yang, but not to get confused with Zekrom and Reshiram, which were yin and yang. But of course Kurium as well as their full half self. One fights for truth, the other one fights for, I'm trying to think, what was the other one fighting for? Power, life. What was it? Life, power. But well, whatever the case, they intertwined it together. They existed together. They saved people. They had their powers, and even they were still trying to find themselves while protecting the people that were probably less fortunate. So I wouldn't be surprised if Lugia and Ho-Oh weren't just a duo of legendaries, but they were also soulmates to each other because they did care for each other deeply. And even if that's something that hasn't been touched upon, that actually does sound like a very interesting concept between their relationships to want to hang out in the same town. I still want to know like what the brass tower would have looked like if it didn't burn down. Probably kind of not as different as Ho-Oh's tower was in the Tin Tower. But what happened was it would be interesting to see if Zapdos, Moltres, and Articuno periodically visited there. And maybe it's possible that maybe Zapdos or Moltres could have also had something to do with burning the tower down too, if that's the case. I mean, that's all debatable. That's all speculation. But if that isn't the case, it would definitely be interesting to see what happens next, though. All I know is, that's why in Gen 2, that's why, like, for example, if you remember what the Kimono Girls used to say in Ecruteak City in the dance theater, they believe that, the only way to really truly bring, and even the sages of the Tin Tower, what was left over, they believe the only way Ho-Ho was going to come back was for a trainer that was pure-hearted to show itself. Now, some people also believe the reason why Ho-Ho left was because it didn't think it could trust anybody. Because the reason why that thunderstorm came that day was because it was built on a bunch of bad karma that was caused by the people. And that's actually kind of an interesting way to look at it too. But it might have just been nature, striking a tower. Because if you don't know, houses, especially in Japan, maybe not back in the day, but as time went on, like if you, especially modern day houses, even if you go to like different cultures, most houses are built with what is known as a lightning rod. So if lightning were to randomly strike a distance, there's something long and pointy enough that it's going to conduct that electricity. It's going to pull the electricity over to the that side of the building, and it's going to take the hit and it's going to absorb it. And maybe that's what the people, like when the old Japanese towers were built, they didn't have such a thing back in those days. So that's what had happened to the, Ho-Oh's tower or Lugia's tower. It just got struck by lightning, and then the rest of it burned down from what it did. And if it wasn't for Lugia, maybe Ho-Oh putting it out at the same time, it wouldn't have existed the way it did. So Ho-Ho's definitely got some mystical powers that we don't see, hence making it a legendary, as well as Lugia maybe if Lugia was responsible for it, would know how to control its own powers up until a certain point, of course. But that's debatable, though. So if I find anything else, I'll talk about it. But right now, I do believe that's just something to really kind of think about. Again, if you have any requests, let me know. I got a Patreon down below if you want to see it. Or if not, don't worry about it. Subscribe if you're not already. And what do you guys think? Lugia, I wouldn't be surprised if Ho-Oh and Lugia were supposed to be in Generation 1 at one point. And then maybe they just decided to push the games back to Gen 2 because of the popularity of it. But it certainly does make me think, because here's another way to think about it. When Gen 2 first came out, it was supposed to technically be the last Pokemon game that was ever made. So as far as the prototype data goes, it's possible that maybe all the Pokemon that we did see would eventually make their way into Gen 1 and Gen 2. But there's still a lot of ideas that are missing, even if they were just drafts of Pokemon. Like, I mean, in Gen 1, for example, it was supposed to be 300 designs. Now, obviously, only 151 made it in, but there was originally supposed to be 191. Now, but they took that and moved it over to Gen 2. But then by the time they got done making Gen 2, as we've seen, there's actual reasons to believe that there were two prototypes of Gen 2, it seems like. You had the original 1997 Space World demo, and then you had the original Space World, you had the original Gen 2, the final version, that, however different that was before they changed that and then decided to add stuff to it. There were, what was it, like 650 Pokemon that were supposed to be in that game by that time, but only 251 had made it. So it's really interesting to make you wonder, what do we not see and what do we not know that we might not be able to see unless we can find it. So that's interesting to think about.